Great. Hey there, fam, bam. Hey there, peoples. Whew. I would like to introduce you to some new additions this week to my tables of vegetation. I have a pineapple, pinaple, because I was jamming out to the magnum opus by Ty Dolla $ign, Gucci Mane, and Quavo called Pineapple. Shoddy super thick, probably tastes like pineapple. I was like, I gotta do it. I bought a pineapple, gotta sing an anthem about pineapples, as one does. And this is a candle, because I forgot candles existed until I went grocery shopping during the same trip in which I bought this pineapple. Turns out candles upgrade your shit a lot, even if it's just in your head. I just feel bougier now. I feel like I have 6 to 12 months of money in a savings account now that I have a candle lit at all times. I feel like I have a diversified investment portfolio now that I have candles in my life. I'm just like, I'm that type of adult. Right? Candles aren't real. That would be dissociating from reality, which segues perfectly into what I wanted to talk about. So today's supposed to be chapter 6. And if you're watching this genuinely to like read this book without having to buy this book, I'm sorry. I can't imagine how frustrating these videos have been for you, having to put up with my observations and dumb jokes. So if you're here just for the chapter, you're gonna have to fast forward when you play this back until much, much later, because I got some shit to say about last week. So last week, reading the last like 10 pages of chapter 5, a couple things happened. Number one, I started talking about the movie Ticket to Heaven as though it is fact, as though it was a documentary and not a fiction movie. And here's what I have to say about that. Ticket to Heaven might as well be a documentary. And the only reason it was not a documentary is because the leaders of Moody workshops were extremely hostile to members of the press. Like they acted like they weren't, but in reality, they were not cooperative at all. They were very like secretive and possessive over their members and their workshops and stuff. As a matter of fact, the instigating event that sort of launched an investigation into Reverend Moon and his estate that eventually landed him in jail for 3 years for tax evasion. That investigation was started by an Irish Catholic mayor of a town in New Jersey who realized that both of his daughters had been recruited by the Moonies and tried to get them back by going to the center where they were living with his wife and his son. And all of them, him, his wife, and his son, were tied up in a room by Moonies. And he says that he was beaten by Moonies after they physically restrained him, and he tried to sue them for that. And the reason he dropped that lawsuit was because they countersued. And that's the thing is like the Moonies, Scientologists, big mainstream cults like this, they have billions of dollars. That's one of the benefits of brainwashing people to give you all their money for decades is you have cash to spend. And in the same way that Scientologists literally, the Church of Scientology bought the hotline that was created for Scientologists trying to leave the cult of Scientology. Like, can you imagine? You're trying to extract yourself from a community that's really abusive. So you dial the hotline that you've been told is a safe hotline to dial. And they say, welcome to the Church of Scientology. How can I help you? Like, what kind of fucking, this was a nightmare for people. And like, that Irish Catholic mayor of like Orange, New Jersey or something, he just turned it into an all-out war. And he used his platform to raise awareness that, like, hey, this is really, I don't recognize my daughters anymore. They're not letting me talk to my children. They tied up and beat me and my wife and our kid when we tried to extract our daughters from whatever's happening. And then as a response, like, the Moonies tried to let this mayor's daughters speak to the press, but they were like, the Moonies were acting like bodyguards around these two girls. They were fielding questions from the press that they refused to answer. And they had the girls read from a script that they wrote on a page. And it's just like anything people tried to do to extract their adult children from this movement was shot down or, hit with expensive countersuits before it could go anywhere. And it took pulling out all the stops and getting like a committee of Congress involved to even just nail Reverend Moon on tax evasion when they wanted to get him for so much more. But all of this like brainwashing, all of this like effectively dopamine hijacking, emotional hijacking, thought reform indoctrination was happening completely within the confines of American law. Because in the United States, there is so much that's protected by freedom of religion, right? Freedom to practice whatever religion you want, freedom of speech. And so instead of being able to create, Vice documentaries or like Sting documentaries like we can now, survivors from the Moonies and people who had to kidnap their own children out of the Moonies and were arrested by law enforcement on behalf of Moonies while trying to hire a kidnapper to get their son or daughter out of the Moonies. Like, in order to have that story be told at all and not be shot down by all the lawyers that billions of dollars can buy, movie makers and authors had to hide their work within the genre of fiction. Does that make sense? It's almost like it's reminiscent of the origins of hip hop in the United States. Like, I remember watching a documentary from Something from Nothing by like Ice Cube, where they talk about how like in Harlem and Brooklyn and areas where the art form of hip hop as activism started, Black people in America had much less access to like live instrumentation. And so they changed to splicing together and remixing 12-inch records, right? And rather than getting arrested for doing what they truly wanted to do, which was like march up and down in the streets like Black Panthers, right? Good morning. Hip hop was created as a form of activism that was protected by the category and the genre of entertainment. So when I'm reading this book, which is based on all of the events that took place in an actual 21-day indoctrination workshop, and when I talk about movies like Ticket to Heaven, technically, yes, they are legally fiction so that they could be protected in telling the truth exactly as it is. Because the events that we're talking about here were too shocking for people to wrap their minds around, and it was upsetting to people that it was legal, and they felt compelled to tell these stories, but they couldn't without getting sued. So it's like, it is fiction because it has to be fiction, because it's so outrageously true and so incriminating that if it's not fiction, it'll get shot down by the multi-billion-dollar estate that is profiting off of human trafficking. Does that make sense? I'm talking to you like you can respond. Can't really. Oh, most people watch this after the fact. Oh, the other thing I wanted to talk about too before I start reading this incredibly short chapter 6, there were 2 moments that from the video last week that have changed me as a person. And for that to make sense, I just want to touch on like betrayal trauma theory introduced by Jennifer Freyd in 1994 at the University of Oregon, Hala. I'm obviously not a psychology student or a professional in the psychology field, but I've recently heard about a theory called betrayal trauma theory. I wrote some of it down. Betrayal trauma theory suggests that an individual, like a child or a spouse, being dependent on another, their caregiver or their partner for support, that individual will have a higher need to dissociate traumatic experiences from conscious awareness in order to preserve the relationship. So basically, betrayal trauma theory addresses situations where people or institutions on which a person relies for protection, resources, and survival violate the trust or well-being of that person. It emphasizes the importance of betrayal as a core antecedent of dissociation, implicitly aimed at preserving the relationship with the caregiver. And there are some criticisms of this theory that mostly revolve around the use of the word amnesia and discussing whether the dissociation is like a biological, uncontrollable amnesia that wipes the memory from that person's brain, or if people just choose to act as though that thing that they can clearly remember didn't happen, even when they're being interviewed for a psychological study. You know, the thing about the study that backs up betrayal trauma theory is there's no conclusive way of knowing whether a person literally like is overcome with amnesia, similar to that you would get if you're sick or have a brain injury, or if they're just so unconsciously motivated to stay the fuck away from a profoundly uncomfortable emotion that even when they're being interviewed for a study about betrayal trauma theory, they just cannot bring themselves to relive that event and would rather not remember it, you know? And I'm sort of like researching these things in between going to EMDR sessions and in between learning about disorganized attachment. Um, Disorganized attachment as a youngster, an infant, and like a young child, it's like the often forgotten attachment style where you're being hurt or abused by your caregiver and you sort of learn to adapt, not by becoming anxious, preoccupied, or like dismissive and avoidant like some people, but by literally just sitting there and dissociating. And it's like I'm beginning to understand, just reading two parts of the last 10 pages of chapter 5 last week. There were two moments where the book, this book, sort of forced me to remember a traumatic experience that I had dissociated away from. I didn't forget those events, but I literally sort of, without really talking it through, I sort of just instantaneously decided that these two experiences did not happen in the real world. They were a dream, or they happened in another dimension. And the two events that I sort of dissociated from that the chapter talked about, so like chapter 5, the last section of chapter 5, Jane gets escorted out of the room because she's talking too much, right? And she's too combative. So they just pluck her out of the room. Then Gary refuses to answer questions about Jane that Carmen has. And he's like, yeah, whatever. So let's talk about you. And then she says, this was the first event that I had sort of shoved away from my memory. Carmen tells him, like, Gary, I'm faking it. I don't believe any of this. Where the fuck is Jane? I'm really uncomfortable. And Gary says, I know you're faking it. That's good. I was actually going to suggest that because that's what I did. And now I'm here. And then you'll be able to be here. And then we'll just be consciously rejecting the outside world and going along with what all these crazy, excitable members tell us to do. Because what else can you do? I've given up on myself. I'm Gary. Nice to meet you. I'm dead inside, and I want you to be dead inside with me. And it's like, at the time when I read that on the page, my first instinct was to laugh and sort of like make a mockery of it, like I kind of did now. And that's because there was a traumatic moment several times where like me and other second generation would see first gen Moonies in our community who had responded to all of their trauma and essentially being abandoned by Reverend Moon once he made enough money and didn't want to like be hands-on with members anymore or have everybody live in communes or give everyone directions every minute of the day. He wanted to sit back with his feet up in his private jet eating like Michelin restaurant food, you know, retiring to a private hospital until he died at the ripe old age of 94. Church members, rather than accepting this and like waking up to the fact that they'd been used and then abandoned by their imaginary messiah, they sort of, as children, my brother and I and other second gen would see these first gen who were acting just like Gary in that moment, where they were almost like lucid in how they were miserable. Gary's like, you just fake it until you can't remember what your problem was. And then it's great. And it's just like, there were moments where it was like, do you, like us as children who were going to school 8 hours a day in like the outside world and going grocery shopping in the outside world and like not indoctrinated on a compound in the middle of nowhere, like we'd just be sitting there like, do you hear yourself? Like, does this adult, are you serious? Like you, there were like nervous tics that could only be the result of decades of dissociation. And like these adults wouldn't be able to tell. We would try to talk to them about their nervous tics and they'd be like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And like, it was just so scary to see. It was scary to us to like see adults completely depart from three-dimensional reality and just sit around telling everyone to join them in their bizarre dissociative twilight zone and just acting like that's normal and acting like that's okay. Like me and my brother, when I read that in the book, I started making jokes about it because I wanted my brother to be here. And I wanted to have that same conversation I've had with my younger brother so many times, where it's just like, Ari, look at me right now. Look deep into my eyes. If I ever start grimacing with 2/3 of my face, the way that our dad does when he's dissociating, you need to slap me across the face. You need to slap that mental disease right out of my body. And then he'd point to someone and he'd be like, if I ever start talking like this, Faith, you need to promise me you're going to put a bullet straight through my cerebellum. Promise me that if I ever start talking like Gary, basically, you're going to paint the wall behind me with my brains because I'm not going out like that. I want to maintain my dignity as a human being. Whatever apocalyptic zombie state takes over this adult's brain and makes them think that this is like a cool or okay thing to say or do, don't let me get to that point. Not like this, man, not like this. Tell me you love me very much and then pull the trigger and make my death quick and painless. This is me. That's the closest thing to like a will and testament we ever wrote. It's like, if I ever start dissociating so hard that I lose touch with modern America and reality, just blatantly acting like a mindless zombie. And it's like, we had to, when I was reading this, I could only access the humor, that humorous emotion that was right before and after the horrifying reality of that situation that we couldn't fit into the narrative of our cult that dictated our every life decision. You know, like if we had actually sat with that discomfort and done something about it and asked for that discomfort to be explained to us and like relieved, it would have just created more fights and more, just put a target on our face to be indoctrinated faster. Like I said, happened with Jane. It's like, that's why, you know, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know if betrayal trauma theory is legit. I don't know, but it sounds legit to me. It sounds like that's exactly what a lot of us did when like you'd hear people talking like Gary and you'd be like, this is really uncomfortable, but if I raise issue with it, then I'll have to find a new place to live and a new way to get food and a new way to get love bombed and a new way to blah. So you just, I'm going to pretend I didn't see that. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. And like where Jane talks, or Carmen talks about having a pile of questions that are unanswered, that are beginning to dull in their urgency for being left and unanswered for so long, is like you literally just shout out to Harry Potter, but you build like a room of requirement just to dump all of your unresolved, dissociated memories that would destroy your lifestyle as you know it and require a whole bunch of uncomfortable changes and uncomfortable conversations with people who are really important to you. So you just don't. And the other part of that chapter that popped a hole in my betrayal amnesia, reached its hand right into my room of requirement and forced me to remember shit that I had dissociated out of my memory. Oh, it was the scene that made me pause for a long time when Carmen goes upstairs and finds Jane surrounded by church members who are chanting Sun Myung Moon. And her being really creeped out, the members not listening at all and just being focused on chanting even louder. Like, if anything, they just get louder because they assume Jane is also possessed by like a lighter version, a diet version of whatever is, or Carmen's possessed by a diet version of whatever's possessing Jane. And then Jane is there having this like dissociative panic attack, this out of body experience, this bizarre indoctrination. I had to pause for a long time because I realized I had memories that I was hiding from myself that made me really, really uncomfortable while I was still in the movement. And I've been so preoccupied unpacking so many other areas of trauma that I never got around to remembering this until I read it on camera. Like, I realized there had been moments in my childhood where I was the person having a dissociative panic attack, or just like, you know, like you see those videos of church camp where kids just sort of like their eyes are rolling back in their head and they might start speaking in tongues or whatever it is, but they're like sweating and they just like, or they're fainting. And then people around them take that as a cue to be even more churchy and like prove how devout they are and like heal them, when what that person probably needs is like a shock blanket and time away from being overstimulated 24/7. You know what I mean? So like, I've been the person who's being chanted around. I've been the person who has depression that other people and the pastor call selfishness, who has everybody chanting around them, trying to get this evil spirit out of them. I've been the person who's had to sort of like dissociate and perform for crumbs of attention and to prove that I'm down for the cause by chanting over people. I have been the person who has seen another person thinking for themselves, and I've thought to myself, like, this person is possessed by Satan. This person is multiplying evil. And I've been the person trying to use some bizarre form of Reiki to heal other people with my chanting in my hands. But here's what's crazy. Here's what fucks me up the most. When I started going to high school, and my parents made the wonderful mistake of finding a cheap apartment in an expensive school district. So I had like a top tier education alongside the children of Nike CEO executives, right? Like, I was taking an intro to psychology class and an intro philosophy class at like 16 years old because they offered international baccalaureate classes in addition to AP classes. So I start learning about critical thinking. I start learning about checking your sources and fallacies in arguments, and you know, just questioning how you can tell whether information is true or whether something is biased. And I started waking up as a teenager, same with a lot of second gen. And by the time I graduated high school and I volunteered to live on a compound where we chanted around people even more so than regular Sunday service, or more than just like once a month at summer camp, I became Carmen in that moment. I became the person. I had moments of lucidity as like a 17 or 18-year-old when I watched a friend of mine from Worcester having a panic attack. We know now it's called panic attacks. Like, I remember she was so angry when she told me and just like needed to tell me so fervently. She's like, remember all those times when we were living on a compound together and people would talk to me about my demon possession and like pray over me and everything. Like, I was a person who like was watching people chant and pray over my friend from Worcester and thinking, this is so fucking weird. Like, this is not okay. Like, literally, what are you doing? And the fact that I thought that really scared me. The fact that I thought that in my head made me scared to like say any of it out loud because I sounded like an outsider, and I knew that if I talked like that, I would become an issue in the same way that my friend from Worcester had become an issue. They were like threatening her to not let her go on a service trip to Africa if she couldn't get this spirit possession under control, you know? And it's like, if I had taken those moments of feeling really uncomfortable seriously, I would have had to leave the movement way earlier than I did before I felt ready to. And these were emotions, moments of lucidity and moments of extreme discomfort that I filed away into a secret chamber of my mind that I like sort of dissociated from, literally designated as never having happened. And when I read this book, it was like, it's like taking bubble wrap and just twisting it, popping all of the secret pockets of dissociative amnesia. So that was a fucking ride. Was there anything else I wanted to say about that? Oh yeah, I guess since we're only at 25 minutes, probably not going to take this long to do the chapter. I think those moments of lucidity, as I learned more about the world and saw more, like those moments of lucidity just became closer and closer together. And there was even a point when I was 18 years old and I was fundraising on like a separate nonprofit that Mooney's made. And I got kicked out of a bar for disagreeing with the partner that I was paired with. You know, after a second gen Mooney girl got raped and murdered in Chicago while fundraising for the Moon estate, my district, we made our own nonprofit that didn't give any money to the Moonies. And whenever girls fundraised in residential areas, or if they knew the sun was going to go down during that fundraising run, they dropped women off with partners. And so I was partnered with this woman to go fundraise at this like series of bars. Even though we were underage, we would like sneak in and sell foil prints. And like, I wanted to give this dude a foil print because he made a good point. He was like, I only have $5 to spare right now. I really like this foil print, like really, really a lot. I've seen you go around and I know you've been doing this for a long time. So I know other people have donated $5 here, $5 there, and that equals $20. If you take my $5 will equal the price that you're asking for in donations to receive a foil print. So can you just count somebody else's donations with my donation and give me the foil print? And I was like, sounds legit to me. I don't really give a fuck. We order these in boxes of 300 at a time for like less than 25 cents a piece. I'm just glad this guy isn't pointing that out. But then the girl I was partnered with was this really hardcore Korean girl, like raised by a church leader from Korea. And she said, no, he can't have the picture of faith. You can't give him that because it's a foundation of faith and a foundation of substance for each person to give $20 in order to receive that foil print. And if we let him combine his inadequate foundation of substance with other people's inadequate foundations of substance, it'll be cheapening the gift and the offering of $20 that every other person who's received a foil print gave, right? And the guy we were talking to heard this conversation. He saw me change my mind. He was like, this is a scam. And he flipped real quick. He went from being real nice to like basically telling us that we were a scam and getting the entire bar to chant at us. Like, it's a scam, it's a scam, it's a scam, it's a scam. And like, I was about to cry. I did cry. It was a terrifying situation. I thought alcohol was evil. I thought people who drank alcohol were like going to be possessed within 5 minutes of consuming whatever liquor it was. Wow, that was like a totally different body and a totally different brain. But like, I had a moment of lucidity where I was like, I agree with this guy at the bar more than the person I've been paired with. And I dead ass for the next like day and a half, I did not fundraise. I was crying in the back of the car to the point where my fundraising captain, also from Worcester for some reason, he had to call the founder of our nonprofit back at headquarters in Seattle and have him talk on the phone to me, because I was ready to quit. I was ready to go home. I was ready to not be a Moonie anymore and try to do something else with my life, because that interaction and the way that our beliefs put me in a humiliating situation that I should not have been in the first place, I was like, I'm ready to break. But like, I didn't want to, because like, I don't know, there's this quote from a documentary I found recently, where this woman's being interviewed about Jonestown, and she says, like, you don't join a cult. You join an exciting club with your friends, with people that you like a lot, with people that you trust a lot, with people that you consider like your family. So it's almost like people wonder why learning factual information doesn't instantaneously wake people up and they don't like buy plane tickets to leave the church center immediately the next day. It's because when it comes to these emotional connections and these friendships that you rely on for your identity, for your sense of worth, you will dissociate whatever memories you need to keep that relationship alive. Especially if you have low self-esteem, which every Moonie does. I'm absolutely convinced. I have not met a single Moonie who does not have crippling anxiety and a low self-esteem. You know, like, if you have a low self-esteem and you're not entirely sure that the rest of the world is trustworthy, like you've been indoctrinated to believe since the moment you're born, it's easier to neglect yourself and pretend conversations didn't happen. Pretend moments that point out your cognitive dissonance aren't that important, just to keep that relationship. And then after a while, when I started making friends outside the church who are sort of like, who were reaching a hand across like the dividing line, proving to me like, here, Faith, have a beer. You won't turn into a werewolf. I promise. Here, Faith, come hang out in a bar as someone who is legally able to hang out in a bar. Notice how everyone is not a three-headed monster and is still a human being. I have a question about your belief. Wow, that's really cool. I'm not like criticizing you and persecuting you the way your church said that I would. Isn't that interesting? Like that is what finally allowed me to sort of take in some of those dissociative moments and take them seriously. And I think ultimately that's what helped me leave. Good 30 minutes. So anyways, let's see what chapter 6 has to say about all this. And then I will get back to my daily routines that help me stop having derealization. Like, I don't know. What happened? Okay, so Carmen comes back from checking on Jane, and Matthew is leading a lecture and has her stand up in front of everyone and punch the air to fight the evil spirits that made her come late to lecture. She told herself over and over that she didn't believe in the spirits, but all that came back to her were some words that Pamela had said. It doesn't matter whether you believe in the spirits or not, they can still attack you. And that's where we left off. Oops, sorry, I keep kicking the desk. All right, chapter 6. That evening, she put herself on remote control. When she was required to smile, she smiled. When she was required to clap, she clapped. When they all stood up and went through the film show, she shuffled off with them, glumly aware of reacting like some cowed mental patient. Just before bedtime, they were called to assemble at the foot of the main staircase, and that was why she found herself standing in the dark at the stroke of midnight as the strains of Happy Birthday struck up on the guitar. Everyone looked around, smiling and expectant. A young man appeared at the head of the stairs, pinpointed by a strategic spotlight. Carmen clapped along with everyone else, although she had no idea of who he was. He looked just like any other Moonie. He sported a very short crew cut and a conservative gray suit that looked like one of Matthew's cast-offs. He looked rather like an American spaceman in civilian clothes. The face was smooth, round, and shiny, and he wore a blissful, abstract grin. Whoever he was, he seemed very popular, but with all the cheering and whistling that was going on, it was impossible for her to catch his name. The crowd at the foot of the stairs parted, and a cake was borne in by a flutter of excitable sisters. It took Carmen a few moments to realize that there was only one candle on the cake, and that they were singing, "Happy Rebirthday to you, Happy Rebirthday to you, Happy Rebirthday, dear Peter, Happy Rebirthday to you." She looked at him again, and a chill went down her spine. They had shaved off his beard and shorn his longish hair. He seemed calm and stable, far too calm, far too dignified and collected for someone who had been trembling on the brink of insanity a short time earlier. There was a quiet, noble confidence that she could only assume to be a supreme piece of self-control. Peter made his way down to greet the cake-bearing sisters at the landing. He held his hands up in an accurate parody of Matthew's banner. "Brothers and sisters," he said, with the fond look of a shepherd overseeing lambs, "I can't say much. My heart is so full. I just want to say, where my soul was in confusion, I have found peace. Where my mind was in torment, I have found release. Where my old life was in little pieces like a torn up page of writing, you have given me a brand new sheet of paper, and I hope Heavenly Father will be able to write on it with his," he paused, struggling to finish in the same high-flown terms, "with his invisible ink." Everyone assumed he meant indelible ink and began to clap and cheer uproariously before he could stutter on about the great inkwell of Father's heart. "He is the glue," she heard him vainly try to shout above the clamor. "He is the inkwell and the glue." So I just did like a podcast episode. A friend of mine who I've already like linked to her Etsy store in one of these previous videos. She goes by on Instagram, she goes by Ren Robot Art, and she has an Etsy account where she's selling merch with the hashtag I got out and with artwork and paintings that she's made that depict the second gen Mooney experience. And she has a podcast called Blessed Child. And I was featured on a recent podcast episodes of her talking about purity culture. And it's just so funny that like, here's Peter making an analogy about his heart being a piece of paper that was ripped apart. Because that's like the same nonsensical analogy that pastors use to explain why you can't have sex with people ever until you're married. Because your heart is a piece of paper that should only be ripped apart by one man who has paid for your dowry. Or whatever it is. He's ink and the glue. The sisters held the touching little homemade cake up to his face. He huffed with all his breath and to wild applause blew out his candle. Carmen paced silently along the dark corridor, holding a plate with a sliver of Peter's cake on it. I'm also avoiding the more serious issue here, which is like, I've seen people make a Peter-esque transformation, even just second gen, who act more like lucid and woke and aware of their surroundings when they're at school during the school year. And then they have a spiritual high during a workshop and they decide to go get matched at 16 in Korea, or they just, shave their head, act all nice. And it's just like such a creepy transformation. And it's amazing to see an outsider put this into words with the transformation of Peter in this story. It was wrapped in a napkin. She had a sliver of Peter's cake. It was wrapped in a napkin and bore molting silver balls. It seemed to her that it represented his past life, discarded like a snakeskin. 2 days ago, it would have been unthinkable. She was taking it to Jane, but even as she paused at the door of the dormitory, she was full of foreboding. She had an irrational premonition that Jane might be swinging lifeless from the ceiling with a noose around her neck. Nothing was predictable any longer. The only thing that was predictable was that everyone would change. Maybe Jane would be inside, dressed in a high-neck, small-print dress, her eyes cast down like a demure nun. In either eventuality, Carmen would be equally unsurprised. As it was, Jane was stretched out on her stomach amongst the other sisters, writing in her book of reflections. Carmen knelt beside her. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Jane looked up and gave her a relaxed, sleepy grin. "I'm fine," she said, "just a bit tired." Carmen continued to search her face for telltale signs. "I am, honestly. Nothing's happened. I'm still the same." "Well, what happened? What did they say to you?" "Nothing happened. Gary made me go and talk to Matthew. I thought he was going to be like the headmaster or something, but he was so lovely. He can be really wonderful, can't he? And Gary's been very sweet. They weren't horrible one bit, just sort of sorry for me. But that just sort of made it worse." She looked at Carmen with troubled eyes. "Matthew really has a way of making you feel ashamed somehow, sort of low and dirty. I don't know, I just felt really horrible. And then it did seem mean saying all those things to Reg. If he believes it and it makes him feel good, well, who am I to? They're so pure and good. They seem so holy. And then what happened? Carmen prompted. Well, then I started crying and he just kept on talking in his soft, sad voice as if I really was a hopeless case. She looked around anxiously to make sure that the sisters weren't listening. And I was telling him how wild I felt today, how out of control. Her eyes were wide as though it was Carmen she needed to convince. I just woke up that way. And he was saying it was the spirits putting up a fight because they didn't want me to believe it. And I was arguing and trying to explain why I couldn't accept it. She looked as if she was about to cry again. And then suddenly I got these sharp shooting pains all over here. She prodded her lower stomach, as if someone had stuck a red-hot poker in me and twisted it round. One minute I was just standing there answering him, and the next I was all creased up on the floor, screaming with pain. It all seemed to explode inside me, just as if there were spirits inside me, as though they couldn't stand hearing what he was saying and they didn't want me to hear it either. She looked at Carmen wonderingly, as if they were trying to draw attention to themselves. Carmen nodded wisely. So do you think that's what they're doing? She asked, throwing a sort of little tantrum. Jane gave her a look of withering scorn. Oh, don't talk to me like I've lost my buttons, she said too loudly, and some sisters turned and frowned at her. Carmen relaxed and moved closer. No, Jane whispered forcefully. It just seemed like that was what was happening. I can't explain it. I mean, there I am rolling on the floor like a demented dog and Matthew praying over me like it's nothing out of the ordinary, and that seemed to quiet them a bit, enough so I could get up. But later it started up again, and then the sisters came and chanted, and this most strange thing happened. Jane struggled to continue against Carmen's obvious hostility. Look, Carmen, I know it's hard to believe this. I don't understand it myself, but it was so incredible. As soon as they started chanting, it took the pain away. There was just these rhythmic waves, like labor pains or something, and then it all just ebbed out of me. She stared at Carmen, willing her to believe. Now, how could that be? She asked. How could chanting someone's name drive pain out? How could it do that unless that person's name had special qualities? Maybe it was just psychosomatic, said Carmen. Jane shook her head vigorously. It didn't feel psychosomatic. It felt like someone was pulling out my intestines like a string of sausages. And then, wouldn't I have to believe in that chant to make it work? But I didn't believe, and it worked. What does that mean? Carmen stalled. I don't know. Well, they could have said anything, like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled pepper. Jane looked skeptical. Oh, come on. Or they could have said Jesus Christ over and over again. She kept her voice very low when she spoke Jesus' name because she had been told that they should avoid using it where possible for fear of causing him pain in the spirit world. Man, yeah, all of this shit is just too weird and too uncomfortable. And it's almost like now that I'm learning more about disorganized attachment, I'm almost wondering if people started telling stories like this as a form of like histrionic behavior where they just like they need something to get attention from people, and they've started to understand that like if I actually express my needs, if I actually say why I'm uncomfortable and that I want to leave, it'll be all bad news. But if I play along and I say that I had a spiritual experience, then I'll be rewarded. I'll be applauded. I'll be surrounded. I don't know, man. I know when I was a little kid, I did that at least a few times. If I'm being honest. Jane lifted an eyebrow. I said Jesus Christ a few times when I was writing, and it only seemed to make it worse. She shifted her bag around as she leant forward. Look, I'm not saying I believe any of it. I don't. I'm just saying this is me, Jane, normal. I'm just telling you what happened. Her face was so earnest that Carmen had to shake her head. I can't explain it, Carmen said slowly. I just know that it's rubbish. It's all rubbish. One of the sisters was standing by the light switch. Sister, it's selfish to whisper when the others want to sleep, she said. Sorry, they chorused. The light went out and the sister picked her way across the settling bodies. Carmen raised herself to her haunches, about to get up. Then she leaned forward and buried her mouth in Jane's hair and whispered harshly, I can't explain anything that happens here. I don't know how it works. I've just got one certainty, and that's that it's all rubbish. Jane reached out and they squeezed each other's hands for a moment as though they were sealing a pact. Then Carmen got up and moved blind towards her bunk and went to bed. Once there, she prayed to her invented god for 10 minutes as a talisman to ward off the evil that she felt was all around her. Then she said, rubbish, 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 over and over again in her head until the syllables ran together in a meaningless mantra, as the syllables of Reverend Moon's name had run together. She dreamed that she was in one of Marianne's team meetings. Even as she sat there, feigning interest in the discussion, she went into labor, but she made not a sound from embarrassment. When she felt the baby emerge, she resisted the temptation to look and pushed it firmly underneath the chair with her feet. Everyone in the room pretended not to notice, and they continued their cordial discussion despite the fact that she was bleeding profusely, and the blood made a conspicuous dripping noise as it splashed on the varnished boards. Then she got a chance to peek under the chair. She saw to her relief that it was not a baby, but a large plastic baby doll with real hair lashes and a red rosebud mouth. It lay there in a bloody mass of afterbirth, with the cord twisted around its neck, and when she picked it up, the squeaker in its back said, "Mama," but it sounded more like a sheep. When she had the chance, she gathered up the dolly and slipped down the corridor to the bathroom, her school chemistry overall slippery with brown blood. She felt an awful guilt, an awful compulsion to get rid of it. There were other sisters in the bathroom, naked at their ablutions, singing in unison, all with garlands in their hair. Her heart was beating very fast, and she tried to force the doll head first down the toilet. It was impossible because it was far too big, almost life-size. She began to wrestle with it, trying to snap its legs off. One broke with a horrible crack, and she looked around in case they should have noticed, but they were too absorbed. Then she picked up the lavatory brush and began to use it like a hammer until the head disappeared down the U-bend, and there was only the problem of concealing the plastic torso, with its one remaining leg and a gaping socket where the second leg had been. She tore off reams of toilet paper and stuffed it down as though to bandage it in tissue and make it less noticeable. Then she slammed the lid and flushed the toilet, but it went on flushing until the water welled up and began to spill over onto the floor, carrying with it its burden of blood and bobbing excreta and tissue paper. She began to swab the floor maniacally with the mop, but the more she swabbed, the more water rose. She peered fearfully into the toilet bowl to see that the baby had righted itself and was fighting for life, choking and spluttering, instinctively trying to pull the swaths of toilet paper away from its blind eyes with its tiny, ineffectual fists. As it rose for air, it began to wail. The sisters looked around myopically for the source of the noise, and Carmen, in panic, began to take hefty whacks at its skull with the lavatory brush until it subsided and she could replace the lid. Then she thrust the seat down and sat on it, without mind to the water, which was still deluging out, soaking her frock. She began to sing along with the sisters, but even through the singing, she could hear the baby's tiny fist knocking weakly against the lid like something buried alive, tapping eerily on the coffin, and she began to sing even more joyfully to drown out the bubbling sound as the tiny mutilated baby groped for air. Well, that was a hell of a dream. And I appreciate the fact that the author is taking the time to fully describe and illustrate the different feelings you have when you're trapped in an emotionally abusive situation where there isn't necessarily any physical trauma happening. I really appreciate that. Because the fact is, when I was little, I had dreams like that all the time. Night terrors constantly. Dreams about being a secret agent and having to shoot my parents. Dreams about running through the streets at night to escape something. All types of dreams. Dreams of being crushed to death. It's just like your brain is trying to make sense of how your needs are being crushed out of you and how you're not okay with what's going on, but you don't know how to articulate it and you don't know how to save yourself. Well, I'm finna eat some food, probably get stoned, probably do a bunch of other things to not dissociate and just come to terms with how fucked up life is. You know what I mean? It's like, what can you do? All this trauma really happened and nobody was held accountable for it, but that's why I do what I do. That's why I do this once a week. That's why I have plans to be more of an activist, but only at the pace that I can without dissociating from reality and sort of losing my sense of worth along the way. Thanks for joining me. Super short chapter. Still made it to almost an hour somehow, but peace out, Cub Scouts.